Now one should look at contact with Asia, specifically Southeast Asia, that is Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Siam or Thailand, Burma, Malaysia, the Dutch East Indies, which we call Indonesia today, the Philippines, and the various archipelagos that are in the Pacific. We'll see first the Spanish and the Portuguese, who are the first arrivals from Europe, followed by the Dutch and the English empires. And you see there the beautiful temple of Angkor Wat, which is the hallmark of the Cambodian civilization, a nation that is emerging from a period of absolute devastation to this day and is now beginning to reorient itself into the modern world. Now, Southeast Asia, unlike China to the north and east and India to the west, had no major empire, but instead was a series of fractious states and islands, such as Thailand, which at the time was called Siam, Burma, which the revolutionary coup today calls Myanmar, Annam, which is the nations of Vietnam and Laos together, and Indonesia, or what will later become known as the Dutch East Indies and then Indonesia. That's the islands of Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and the Celebes, and the Philippines. The Portuguese and the Spanish arrive, and they establish trading posts. The Portuguese established the trading posts of Malacca and Macau, and the Spanish established Manila in the Philippines. The wealth of Southeast Asia is silk. This is really what is getting people to go to the marketplaces back in Europe. Silk and spices, such as pepper and nutmeg. We don't think anything at all going to our grocery stores and going to the McCormick shelf in the grocery store and finding nutmeg or paprika or cumin or whatever. But back in these days, this was something entirely new and was a rage, just as much a rage as, say, Pokemon would be today, or any sort of new fashion trend would be. Let us not forget that another thing came out of Southeast Asia as well, tea. And tea became drunk by many in the European countries, especially England, although most of the tea comes from India. There's a great deal of tea that comes out of Southeast Asia as well. In the typical European fashion, the various exploring states arrive in Southeast Asia and begin to jockey with each other for other people's territory. The Portuguese take control of Ceylon, which is the nation of Sri Lanka, the island just to the south of India, Taiwan, which is the island of Formosa, and the East Indies, which is now called Indonesia. However, the Portuguese, as I have said before, lacked the strength and the technology to maintain their hold in Southeast Asia. One other thing about the Portuguese is that they did not have many problems intermarrying with the natives. They were not as, shall we say, racist in their beliefs. Although there was a certain amount of racism there, they certainly had no problem intermarrying with the natives. The Spanish, on the other hand, are a different sort altogether. Now, Magellan arrived in the Philippines in 1521. It was named after King Philip, of course. Spain used the Philippines as a colony to establish markets with China because the Philippines is one of the gateways to China. Now, Spain settles in and colonizes, unlike the Portuguese do, and they convert most of the Filipinos and acculturated the Filipinos as Spanish. And this is why when you meet a Filipino, you'll see that they have Spanish first names and surnames like Martinez and Aquino and Corazon and Juan and so forth, Ferdinand and so forth. They established a very hierarchical plantation system, and this leads to a major exchange between the Americas and Asia because Manila has one of the greatest deep sea ports in the world that gives you access to China. And China is always, remember, the key for these nations. To trade with China is the ultimate goal. Even to this day, trading with China seems to be the ultimate goal. When your next quiz opens on Friday, I will be including now map locations as well. And so you need to start getting yourself acclimated with some of the places on maps throughout the world because maps are very important. We historians like dates, we like names, but we also like locations. And there you see on the map of Asia some of the major trading posts and places that were colonized by the Portuguese and the Spanish. You have the island of Ceylon, which is to the south and east of India. You have Siam or Thailand, located in Indochina or Southeast Asia. You have the port of Macau, which is not far from the port of Hong Kong, which the British will soon establish. There's the island of Formosa, which we call Taiwan today, and you see there the Philippines. And you see in all of these places their proximity to China and the access that controlling these places allows when it comes to access for China. The Dutch and the English followed up soon after the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, the Dutch got the technology and got the sailing charts from the Portuguese the old-fashioned way. They stole them. And because they were able to steal the Portuguese sailing charts, they were able to start sailing into the Indian Ocean as well and establish bases. They captured Malacca from the Portuguese in 1640. The Dutch then take control of Ceylon and the East Indies after 1750, and the Dutch will remain in control of the East Indies until it becomes Indonesia after the Second World War. After the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the Dutch then gained control of most of the Indian Ocean shipping, which the Spanish had been in control of. Now, in addition to this, you also had another group of arrivals, and this is Mings from China. Many of the supporters of the Ming dynasty and many Ming Chinese fled China after the Qing dynasty took over. And they fled to the East Indies, and they brought with them a great deal of wealth, and they established themselves in cities like Saigon and Hanoi and Malacca and Macau and Singapore and so forth in Chinese districts. And because of this, this caused an economic boom. The Dutch and the English, both with their international corporations, the Dutch East India Tea Company and the British East India Tea Company, now control the trade of major staples. That is, staple crops or bulk crops that bring in a lot of money. Coffee, indigo, which is the blue dye that's in your blue jeans, and of course, most importantly, tea. Just as the Spanish and the Portuguese had a great rivalry, so also did the English and the Dutch. Now, after 1776, which is a rather interesting year, I think you all would believe, the British gained prominence in the Indian Ocean. And one of the reasons why they gained prominence in the Indian Ocean is they don't have to worry about their American colonies anymore. The British seized most Dutch possessions in Asia, but then they returned them after they were defeated by Napoleon for a time. The main British possession is the great island fortress that sits right at the tip of the Malay Peninsula called Singapore. Singapore is one of the great micronations on Earth. It's a very small island, but it is its own country. You might have remembered that Singapore was the place where the previous president tried to engage the Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, better known as Little Kim to me, in a summit that didn't really go anywhere. Again, you had the immigration of Chinese as well as Indians who would help with the labor, and this brings in a great deal of wealth for the Singapore colony. The communities stay together. That is, Chinese communities stay with Chinese people and Indian communities, Indian, but they live side by side in relative harmony. And this was a very effective way of working. And it is in no small way dissimilar from the situation in New York City after the English take over New York. The multitude of people in that city, which also, by the way, was on an island, lived side by side in relative harmony. So again, you see here on the map the port city of Malacca, which the Dutch captured from the Portuguese, and the island nation of Singapore, which was a British colony all the way up until right after the Second World War. And this is going to be a very significant place, especially when we come to the Second World War, and how important Singapore was in control of the passageways between Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies.